this episode of Quake Dub. Now, in this episode, I wanted to look at do another book review. I haven't done one in a while. And this one is another Quaker Quicks and is Rufus Jones and the Presence of God by Helen Holt. And I loved it. Now, before we get into that, I think want to make something really clear. I have been accused, yes, of being, and I quote, a Rufus Jones fanboy. And I have some beef with that. I know where it's coming from, but I also anyway. So basically, I think it came around quite jokingly. It wasn't meant offensively, but I kind of took offense, and I think that's interesting in of itself. So why might people come with that? Well, because people know that I particularly focus on early liberal Quakerism, so the Quakerism between 1895 and the early 1900s, that sort of period before the First World War, and that was the period where obviously Rufus Jones really came to the fore. Fine, and so because that's the era of Quakerism that I'm really interested in, and because Rufus Jones kind of has become synonymous with that era, hence the moniker. So he's obviously of absolute importance to this era of history and beyond. I mean, I think without question, if not top five, if you had to look at Quakers throughout our history, so you can't just ram it all with early Quakers. If you had to be consistent and look throughout our entire history, Rufus Jones has to be top five in terms of influential Quakers. I can't see who else realistically takes those positions. Though maybe that would be a good video. Maybe I do that. But anyway, I think he would have to be up there. And so, therefore, if I like that period and that's the period where he came in, then there we are. My cats are fighting. But why did I take offence by it? I think might be a worthwhile question for me to ask myself as well. Well, I think I took offence by it. I want to say take offence. Obviously, I wasn't mortified, but I mean, I was a bit like, nah. Because I suppose he is in many ways quite a controversial figure. I mean, I suppose anyone who achieves that level of influence will have supporters and naysayers. And I think I think when I read this book, I would probably put myself maybe more in the naysayer camp than I am now. I think now that I've read his biography, I feel I understand his position a bit better. But I think the main reason is I disagree with not a lot. I disagree with the ramifications of some of his simplifications of Quaker theology. I think his ultimate equating the inner light with conscience, I think, has led Quakerism on a very different trajectory, which has some, I think, certainly for him, unforeseen consequences, and I think can water down the Quaker theology and where it was going pre Rufus Jones. But we'll look at that in a bit more detail as well. But I think it's also as well quite a lot of his main beliefs or theories regarding certainly the origins of Quakerism have been debunked, and so you listen to you read a Rufus Jones tract talking about the things he talks about, which we'll go into more detail in a minute, and you're like, well, no, Rufus Jones. And so I think on the one hand, I think it's very interesting that the Rufus Jones fanboy moniker was labeled on me against my will, but also interesting why I sort of balked at it instead of embracing it. And obviously, because what I actually really, really want is to be known as a John Wilhelm Rowntree fanboy, but no one seems to. One day. So Helen Holt, I mean, this it's a Quaker Quick, so it's very quick, but it's literally, if you get rid of the notes, it's 72 pages long. But I just loved it. I loved it because it gets to it it gets to the point really quite quickly. So in the preface, literally on page 1, the main things that are sort of the highlights and the main kernels of his influence and his controversies are in there. So Holt starts by saying he concluded, that being Jones, concluded that humans and God were in fact intimately related, and discussed his ideas in terms of the inner light and mysticism. The inner light was a way of expressing his belief that God is present within us as part of our very nature, and mysticism was a way of exploring his conviction that all of us can know his presence. And then further down on the page, we get the controversy. While some wholeheartedly embraced Jones's ideas, relieved that he had made faith in their experience of God intellectually credible, others were dismayed or even outraged, accusing him of taking Christ out of Quakerism and making the soul divine. So there we go, right there and then. That's the problem. So he is known for effectively the invention of the term inner light. He's widely credited with that, and with the idea of Quakerism being a mystical religion, or coming from a medieval mystical tradition rather than from the Puritan tradition. I think you get a very important thing about Rufus Jones's character in that opening segment as well, is that he was someone who was very deeply spiritual as a man. You read about his childhood, and you get a sense that this was a guy that religion was a way of life for him, and he lived that. And I've got nothing but respect for that, and I wish that my life were, you listen to his childhood, and yeah, it sounds like some bits were really quite awful, but also sounds quite idyllic in a lot of ways. The problem, though, I think people had with certainly the inner light, how he understood it, was that it was the equating of the conscious with the inner light, that the inner light was our consciousness. And by doing that, making the consciousness and therefore ourselves divine, then that has some very tricky theological things to have to untie as to what are we worshipping. And people were also kind of dismayed by the lack of focus he put on the historical Jesus, or the Christian the Christian story as a part of Quakerism. That's where we start getting a bit of a rift. Now, Jones was certainly 100% Christian in his outlook, but by talking about and intellectualizing the inner lights and Quaker theology that way, it opened up an interpretation which didn't didn't need Christ in it, for better or for worse. I know I have my views on that, but I think that's where that opens up, and with that opening up gets allows for the diversity that now exists in liberal Quakerism, which is great for so many reasons, but also leads to issues and controversies and fallout. So if you're looking for a source and someone to blame for all that, then Rufus Jones is an obvious scapegoat. So just to clarify for anyone who doesn't know, in terms of the time period we're talking about here, so Rufus Jones was born in 1863 and died in 1948. So that's the kind of period we're looking at. And in her first chapter, Helen Holt looks to kind of give the rough outline of his life. And so we find out that he was born in rural Maine, in a place called South China, which is very confusing. But South China, which is in Maine, which is in America, not South China. And so it seems really rural. So he's up to all sorts of japes. So he's like going there, running around. There's like a massive lake which he likes. There's woods. He's working on farms. So it's very rural. And I suppose that's the element which I think that's quite nice. But obviously, rural America in like the 1860s is obviously also not necessarily the place where you're going to get the best health treatment, for example. So that he does have a lot of health issues going on with him throughout his life, and he blames, especially I think his dentistry, on the poor health service that he got as growing up in rural Maine. So in terms of who Rufus Jones was, so he was an academic. So he was at Harvard, and the people who we met at Harvard were he was at Harvard for a while. were very influential in terms of his understanding, in terms of his academic understanding of Quakerism. But he was also at Haverford, which is a Quaker college, so and that's where he spent most of his time. And so he was teaching philosophy, but also psychology, which is also very important in terms of understanding his theology as well. But then again, um, he was also the editor of the American Friend, a very influential journal, and he was very important in setting up I always forget what it's called, the American Friend Service Committee, which was basically a Quaker alternative to taking part in war. So this was set up in 1917, obviously when America joined the First World War, but then was very influential in the Second World War. There's a nice little passage of him trying to go into Nazi Germany in the 1930s to try and plead the case for the Jews, and them having like a silent meeting for worship in the Gestapo office, which uh, that kind of baffles me. I don't know why I would. Uh, anyway, Rufus Jones. He's a fantastic guy. I don't want to come off as too negative, because I would be fascinated to talk to Rufus Jones. I would find it very intellectually enriching and spiritually enriching, I'm sure. So I really don't want to put him down. I actually think this is what it came out when I read the book. I'm like, God, he's a great guy, and he gets a really bad. I think he gets stuck with a lot of issues which he wasn't actually putting out there himself, but did come out of what he was talking about. So the next chapter of the book is kind of looking at his inspirations, which is actually really interesting because I didn't know any of this in terms of people that he engaged with and people who Rufus Jones thought that basically set the groundwork for his theology and his beliefs, which obviously no one creates this in a vacuum. They're always inspired by people, and is really interesting to kind of work out who these inspirations were for him. Apart from outside like family, I knew that his family were obviously really important and influential in terms of his spiritual background, but in terms of his like academic theologizing, I suppose, who were his role models there. So she talks about Ralph Waldo Emerson, the poet, William James, the kind of founder of psychology, if you know what I mean, and Josiah Royce as well. And it's interesting to see like the things that he takes from these three people to sort of build his own outlook. So with Emerson, so he was a poet. It wasn't a Quaker, though. I think he muddled with Unitarianism as far as I'm aware, and I think he said at one point that he would identify with being Quaker more than anything else, but I don't think was ever actually a Quaker. But what he said about Quakerism, I think Rufus Jones found quite interesting. So he said that was where he Emerson linked the inward light of Quakerism with the sort of religious and mystical experiences that you saw in other faiths, which obviously Rufus Jones would definitely tap into. Another idea that uh, Rufus Jones really liked from Emerson was the idea of the oversoul. So the idea that God and humanity are related, and because every member of humanity is related to God, therefore everyone in humanity is related to each other as well. And so by looking at it like that, then the idea of God and everyone links Quakerism to the ideas of Emerson. Next up with William James, so obviously as the father of psychology, this is where Rufus Jones connects the idea of the inner light with the subconscious. So this famous linking, and I think it's very 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 clear from what Helen Holt says is that this is something that he gets very clearly from William James. So she says that Jones thus used the material from William James's books, Principles and Varieties, to argue that God was an integral part of human nature, and that the subconscious was the meeting place. It was here, he speculated, he being Jones, that there may be some real Shekinah where we may meet with the divine companion, that more of life in whom we live. It's important to note that as well that William James wasn't a Christian, whereas obviously Rufus Jones definitely was. So he was trying to blend this idea of the subconscious with the idea of religion, and he Christianity, and he did this by looking in particular at this idea of the inner seed, of the inward light, and what this was. So this is something that goes right back to the early Quaker beliefs. Berkeley really laid this out as to what is this connection between us and the divine. And obviously, Berkeley did it in a sort of psychological age, and he talked about the vehiculum Dei, so the seed of God, and that this wasn't God, but was of God, and is within us, or we can have access to that. And for Jones, this is what the subconscious is. It's something that is us, but isn't us, and can be of God. And because he would then link that with our moral outlook, again, the assumption that our morality is there because of religion is kind of understood as given, whereas I think obviously nowadays that would be a highly disputed point. He obviously saw that as a given. And the last one is Josiah Royce. Now, she starts. Helen Holt starts by talking about the influence of Josiah Royce on Rufus Jones by saying it's very complicated. His thoughts are very complicated, and then she goes on to sort of like explain. And I'm still at a loss. So see what you make. So it goes like this. His thought is complex, yes, but essentially he argued that all aspects of reality, including those we experience as contradictory, are unified in the thought of a single all-encompassing consciousness. So this is absolute idealism, often referred to as the absolute. And William James disagreed with this, which is amazing because I'm still trying to understand what it is. So we're all connected, that consciousness is all interlinked. I can see why Jones would like that. Okay, cool stuff. Move on. Despite that, well, I don't know. I felt like that when I was talking to Ben Wood. It's not my area at all. So I always feel like an absolute novice, and it's like really highbrow, and maybe that's really simple, but not to me. Despite that, when doing his theology, Helen Holt says that there are two things that is really important to Rufus Jones. One is that he really wants to link Quakerism with science, philosophy, and biblical criticism. So biblical criticism is, well, criticizing the Bible, but not necessarily like saying it's bad, but trying to maybe understand it from like a sociological, a psychological, a historical outlook instead of just taking it for its word. But on the other hand, he also wants to have a dynamic Christian life and not simply just an armchair theological outlook, which is kind of like what I was describing before. But that's not what he wants. He was very outgoing. He was very socially gifted. He loved being with people. He loved speaking. So he wanted that sort of life, and I think we don't want to just be arguing about theology the whole time. We want to be going out certainly as Quakers and living a Quaker life. In terms of then his outlook on God, because I think this is interesting because, as I said, he's known for opening up the floodgates to universalist Quakerism and a wider understanding, a wider theological understanding of Quakerism than had previously been accepted, I suppose. And so his understanding of God is quite interesting. So she starts off by saying that foremost for Jones was that God was characterized by love. Great. I think everyone's okay with that. And that this love was the desire and the active working to bring about the kingdom of God into the world. He also felt that the presence of God was immanent, not imminent but immanent, and this has been criticised. Holt explains because he believed so much in this presence of God that God was everywhere, that it can lead to a sort of pantheism, that everything is God. It can also mean that if humanity can meet with God in this with this inner light in the subconscious, and this is an integral part of humanity, that the sort of redeeming quality of Jesus in the Christian in the Christian story, that doesn't really have any effect. It can do without it. So, as I said, kind of allowing this experience of God without seemingly, and he would reject this because he did not believe this, but seemingly without the potential for needing for any sort of redeemer um, in in order to access that relationship. So, what's the role of Jesus in terms of for Rufus Jones? So Holt sort of says that he comes from, he looks at it as he draws from James's discussions of ideals. She says so, talks that how Jesus provides us with the ideals that are far above those produced by anyone else, and that attracts us to God. And so she says anyone who wants to know more about music would go to the great heroes of music, so like Beethoven and Bach and all those sorts of people, instead of Ariana Grande. No offense. So the importance of Jesus is to be like a moral teacher, I suppose, which is, compared to many other denominations, a vastly watered down version of what Jesus is, or the purpose of Jesus, if you will, the mission of Jesus, than what Rufus Jones is suggesting, especially if you understand that actually these ideals, which he links so fervently to Christianity, nowadays, that would be heavily disputed as that's actually not enough. That's not enough proof that Jesus is. If that's your only argument for the importance of Jesus, then there's going to be a lot of people who are going to come and dispute you on that. So let's come on to the inner light then. So what is Rufus Jones trying to do here? So what Helen Holt says that he didn't like, because he didn't invent the term. Well, he may have invented the term inner light, but he certainly didn't invent the importance that the phrase light within Quaker theology that goes all the way back. But he didn't like what Robert Barclay said about the inward light. And he seems mainly not to like it because it was dualistic. And by that he means that it was supernatural, that it wasn't an innate part of human consciousness, which is precisely, or subconsciousness, I suppose, which is precisely what he's trying to get at. So this is something that isn't like passed down to us. This is something that is integral to our being. This isn't something that is, that is sort of like a Durchbruch, as Martin Luther would have it. It's not this breakthrough into our consciousness. This is or into our soul. It's already there, and so it's not. Whilst he doesn't deny that it is of God, he's saying that it's also kind of humanity as well. So this is a quote. So he says, as he put it, he being Jones, it had been envisioned, so by Berkeley in the past, as foreign to human nature rather than as something that a man has as man. Obviously, dated, so human as human, maybe we'd say today. Holt does say that, and I do agree. I think Berkeley's going. I think Rufus is attacking Berkeley quite unnecessarily there. I think that's not actually what Berkeley says. I think if you actually read Berkeley very carefully, I don't think he's saying that it's like this distant thing that we can't access. I mean, he says very clearly that we have to nurture this seed, this vehiculum, in order to become, in order to have and be able to listen to the inner light at all. We have to foster it. So it's obviously within us. Otherwise, how on earth are we doing that? He might be looking more at Berkeley's idea of days of visitations, which is interesting, and I suppose that is certainly like God coming to quiz you and test you, which I suppose he might not be looking like if he sees that this is integral to our being and not something that we get if we pass a day of visitation, maybe. So Helen Holt does go on to say sort of what I was saying is that, well, hang on. So if we believe that there is that of God inherently within our humanity, as part of our subconscious, then the idea of theodicy comes in. So the nature of evil. How can we be, if we have God at the center of our subconscious, why are so many people, or why do so many people decide to do decidedly bad things? Another sort of criticism that Holt brings in against that, not necessarily that she believes that, but that is brought against Rufus Jones, is that he was a humanist. Now, I follow the humanist Quaker on Twitter, and so I wonder what he would make of this. So because Jones was a humanist, Quakerism today is humanist, and some people might be against that. However, Rufus Jones says himself that, and I'm quoting now, consistently asserted that he was opposed to humanism because it reduced humans to natural beings, and he claimed that it was impossible for someone to lift themselves by their own belt into a life of consummate truth and beauty. Although our efforts are good and our moral enthusiasm is noble, there is a cosmic free grace working for us, he insisted, and our best line of action is to align ourselves with it. So, humanist Quaker, if you're listening, I do wonder what you would make of that. What do I make of that? Well, it sounds very anti-Pelagian, so I suppose it's fitting in kind of with general Christian thought that you can't do good solely by yourself. You need God in order to do good, because you yourself can't do it, because assumedly you are a sinful being or whatever. And so therefore we need sort of the God of our consciousness in Rufus Jones's understanding. We need that in order to have any hope of doing good. Otherwise we won't do good. So it's then the next part that Helen Holt comes over to discuss is the mysticism aspect. So and so this is probably, arguably, I'd say, the most famous Rufus Jones theory, mainly because it has been so refuted nowadays. But I think also it was very popular at the time, and I think the more and more I read about him, I see that he is very much of his time. He especially a lot of his major works were coming out sort of early 20th century, and so he is of that time, and so for better and for worse. And so his the mysticism theory, if you will, was that he wanted Quakerism to have its roots not in the Puritan world. So he would argue that instead of Quakerism coming from or being influenced by Puritan or Reformed theology, that it came instead from this sort of cultural mysticism that was certainly in the continent and in the same sort of time period and bit before, and reaching further back into what's called medieval mysticism. Now, mysticism can mean lots of different things, and so I think this is where it can get quite problematic and tricky. I'm actually reading a really good article in Quakerism in the Atlantic World, just kind of looking at mysticism in Quakerism and how that's really complicated as a term, because there's a very big difference between, say, the mysticism that existed in Catholicism, say, in the late 16th century, early 17th century, to medieval mysticism of like Meister Eckhart, for example. And yet Rufus Jones kind of puts them in the same boat. But mysticism can look very different as well. So, like, you could be maybe very aesthetic in your mysticism, so like retreating from the world. But that's not what Rufus Jones is looking to do. He very much wants his mysticism, his Quaker mysticism, to be outward and engaging, as I said before, in an active Christian life. Rufus Jones, or Helen Holt, in terms of how she describes Jones's understanding of mysticism, separates mysticism into two categories. So you talk about a negation mystic, which is kind of what I was talking about earlier. So that would be the one that would put themselves out of the world, and an affirmation mystic, which, and I'm quoting now, says that affirmation mystics also seek an immediate first-hand sense of God, like the negation mystics, but in contrast to them, as a prelude to action, and not as an end in itself. It's a mysticism of everyday life, in the sense that God is found not by negating the finite, but in the finite. which I like that, because that makes me think of the incarnation and like the imbuing of God in humanity. And so you can see from Rufus Jones's background, that's something he's going to be very into. So he's all about, it leading to action, and that there is an everyday communication and relationship between humanity and God. And I've got nothing wrong with this kind of understanding of what a Quaker spirituality would be. That yes, I believe it should lead to action, and yes, I think it should be like an everyday relationship with God. I think that's all good and great. I think the problem is just the kind of the washy term of mysticism there, because obviously a lot of these people weren't necessarily these mystics that he mentions. Um, uh, wouldn't necessarily all agree with each other, and wouldn't necessarily even call themselves mystics in the same way. And so it just becomes a very washy backstory, and trying to link these. So then you'd have to then understand that these people who became Quakers, whether you like it or not, were living in a Puritan world. I mean, to say that George Fox wasn't of a Puritan background is ludicrous. Even if he was reading the Quaker mystics, the Catholic mystics, he would still interpret them under a Puritan lens. So you can't separate them. And so I'm not denying. I think especially with Jacob Boehme, for example, I think it's very, very likely that the early Quakers read Jacob Boehme, but who was a mystic. But they would still understand him under the mindset of a reformed theology. So it would take on a new meaning anyway. So I think I think it's not very rigorous when you actually really delve into it. And it has, many people have done this a lot better than me. I'm reading one right now. I think it's great. Just really kind of getting to the bottom of that a little bit. The nice bit that I like is that Holt says that um, that the whole message of the gospel in the Bible can be encapsulated in the parable of the prodigal son. And I like this in particular because this is a John Wilhelm Rowntree idea, or at least it will be for Jones. This is something that John Wilhelm Rowntree talked about a lot. I'm not saying that he invented it. I'm sure he did not, but certainly because they were such good friends, this is clearly coming from him. So basically how that the idea of the gospel is the idea of bringing God, or bringing humanity back to God, which is then in contrast to what Rufus Jones was saying about the fact that God doesn't need to draw us back in, because he's already in our subconscious, and we are with him in our subconscious regardless of what we do. So you see my point. The whole point with Jones is that he has all these ideas which are great, but they don't necessarily always match up or hold up to scrutiny, and it makes it just a bit disappointing. I think good thing and she does mention this a lot, Holt, in her biography, that he is writing theology for the common man, so to speak. So so this is not meant to be for theologians and for the same rigorous analysis that he's certainly been subject to, because he was writing for everyday people. He wasn't using he wasn't debating academics on this. He was just trying to explain Quaker theology for the everyman. Again, something which John Wilhelm Rowntree was definitely trying to do with adult education and so on. A really lovely way that she ends her biology of Rufus Jones is by kind of looking at maybe like his most parts of his life, or parts of his thoughts, and then giving some suggestions in a very Quakerly way. So she looks at things like, appreciating beauty in nature, the role of suffering, study, friendship, developing virtue, prayer and silence, meeting for worship, and then at the end she gives suggestions, or like Jonesian suggestions, I suppose. So talking about Jones in terms of these things, you talk about how these aspects affected Jones's life, and then in suggestions she gives like a Jonesian take on how to deal with those things. So if we look at maybe one of them, so the suggestions for prayer, for example. So she talks about like Jones's stories, Jones's life experiences with prayer. And then at the end of the suggestion, it comes with what thoughts, feelings, and images or memories come to mind when you think of prayer? Is there anything that attracts or disturbs you when reading about Jones's prayer life? Is prayer or meditation something you would like to explore further? If so, what initial step could you take? And then she gives some examples. So she talks about Rex Ambler's A Light to Live By, and The Experiment with Light, which you can get as an app, by the way, and The God of Surprises by Gerard Hughes. So I think that's a really nice way of ending it, because I'm very Quaker, because it kind of sounds like the advices and queries, and gets you to sort of re-engage with the main kind of topics of the biography, and kind of it basically gives a way of talking, do like a further reading, or like, but also spiritually as well, looking at it as an opportunity to either be more Rufus Jones, I suppose, or like to just, because as I said, he was certainly very spiritual. He's a very weighty friend, as one would say, and so he certainly is an inspiration in terms of, one, because of his intellectual thought and his discourse, what he's done for Quakerism, but also because he's just a very, as I said at the beginning, very highly spiritual. And I find that really important, because and it's certainly something that I always forget, and what I always love about this time in Quaker history, where it was this merging of the two, where the coming together of religion and science and religion psychology, but was still imbued by a deep spirituality, which I feel sometimes is lost in modern Quakerism where we are now. And so, yes, I think I really like this biography. I think it's, you feel, I came out of it feeling like I've learned a lot, not just about Rufus Jones, but about like the milieu he lived in, his background, his academic background, his theology, and I came out feeling quite, I think with a lot of these Quaker Quicks, I come out feeling quite hopeful. I feel like, oh, I want to try that. I want to go through some of those suggestions. I want to think about that. I'll bring that to meeting for worship with me, and think about it. So thank you very much, Helen Holt, for an excellent biography, and I'll put a link for it in the description down there. Let's start a discussion. I think I've tried to be maybe hopefully quite balanced about Rufus Jones. I wouldn't say I am a fanboy of Rufus Jones, but what do you think? How important is he for you as a Quaker? Had you ever heard of him before? Had you never heard of him before? That'd be very interesting if you haven't. What do you think he's been a force for good for Quakerism? Do you think he's been a force for evil in Quakerism? Are all the controversies about him justified, or should we stop giving him such a hard time? Happy to have a discussion. And so I hope that was illuminating in some way. But please do buy the book. A lovely Quaker Quick to add to your collection. And I will see you next time for another video on Quake It Up. See you later. Thank you very much for watching the video. If you liked it, please do click on the thumbs up and the subscribe button to get more videos about Quakerism in the UK today. It really does help, and thanks once again.